Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing. Hi, and welcome to Influence to Death, your guide to navigating the wild world of wellness influencing. I'm your co-host, Victoria Lafont.
I'm your other co-host. Oh, sorry. So I clear my throat there.
We have like a tradition of complete train wreck beginnings. I love it. Let's just keep it.
Okay. I'm Hannah Wright, your other co-host. And today we have Dr. Sara Russell back on the podcast to talk more about the postpartum period, right? We talked about pregnancy last time, and now we're going to focus more on postpartum. I'm super stoked about this episode. Thank you, Sara, for coming on again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back. And I apologize about my headphones. My kitten literally ate the foam on my others and chewed the wires. And I had to ask my son to lend me his gaming headphones, which are the only working headphones we have in the house.
I just realized that they're like LED, like
they
light.
Are. Yes.
Yeah.
They're very spiffy and there was no way to turn off the light. So I apologize.
At least you know what happened to your other ones. I had these ones that were over the ear that I loved. They were Andrew's, and I have no idea what I did with them. I think I left them in an airport, maybe. That's my best guess. So
yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump in. We have right at an hour to cover some of what we wanted to cover the last time, and then we definitely want to make sure that we get to the new research that Sara has brought about postpartum. And Sara actually saw on Facebook some of the research you were posting. It's like brand new research.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure to get to that. Okay, so kind of the first bit that I want to dive into first that we did not get into the last time, there are certain conditions. I think you touched on this last time, but there are certain conditions where understanding the pregnancy specific ranges are really important. And the two that, you were, very specific about is preeclampsia and thyroid health. So is there anything else that you want to say about that, just as kind of a follow-up from the first episode?
I don't remember how much in depth we got into the preeclampsia piece. I think that we just went a little bit surface level, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is just wildly important. So what we found in the research is that there are 6 very significant, easy to run, fairly affordable blood markers that can help detect early risk of preeclampsia. 5 of these as early as the first trimester. And the sixth is LDH. And that we don't know yet if it's valid as an early preeclampsia marker in the first trimester, but we do know that starting at week 20 of pregnancy, it does have validity. So these include uric acid.
We can list them in the show notes too, Sara.
Yeah. Neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, GGT, ALK phos, and right now I'm just missing one. And then LDH. But yes, these are really significant, really easy to run. The neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is actually just a calculation that you can run on your calculator. Or if you have Lab Smarts will run it for you. We'll just divide the neutrophils by the lymphocytes, but it's a really easy calculation. And essentially,
and actually, just want to remind people, Lab Smarts is the bloodware software that Marianne Marks created, and all of the pregnancy and postpartum specific ranges are in that blood work software. It's like an interpretation software. Most functional practitioners are familiar with that kind of style of software, but just to remind people what that is when you say Lab
thanks.
Smarts.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So, having an elevation in one of these markers doesn't necessarily mean that you will get preeclampsia, but it does indicate that you might be at higher risk of preeclampsia. The neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is a really important ratio to look at in pregnancy because it can show other things like miscarriage risk. For example, a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio of over 5 is just a general indicator of higher risks in pregnancy. But you have to be careful because there are some situations, like I learned, for example, working with the autoimmune population, some people are put on low-dose prednisone or other corticosteroids during pregnancy to suppress an overactive immune system. And that's appropriate and important, but it can elevate the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio without that actually meaning that they have an elevated risk. Just because it suppresses lymphocytes and the neutrophils just go up. They're just supposed to go up. So you always have to look at the bio-individual situation. I think it's also really important to say that clinically, especially any unlicensed practitioner should never say, oh, you're at high risk for preeclampsia. We don't want A, to make people alarmed, but B, we can take action we can say, look, there are some things that we might want to optimize. Here's some lifestyle tips for you. Here's some nutrition things you can take. You might want to, say, take some fish oil. You might want to try a little bit of extra vitamin E containing foods.
Melatonin
Melatonin, I don't remember. Is that
for
associated
preeclampsia.
with
Do you know how I know that is
Maybe.
because Amanda Jones, and I think she would be totally I'll ask her before we publish this. I think she would be totally cool with me speaking to this. She had just the main marker of high blood pressure, but
Mhm.
it turned out like as she was starting to go into labor, they were like, you are incredibly preeclamptic. But she used melatonin to manage her blood pressure throughout her third trimester. And I think she
Wow.
did a bunch of research on
Yeah.
melatonin's connection
Wow.
to helping support people who are at higher risk or
Yeah.
have preeclampsia. Is
Yeah.
preeclamptic, is that even a term?
That's very cool. I mean, melatonin is such an amazing compound, really.
Incredible.
But, even like oyster mushrooms and white button mushrooms, there was a white button mushroom study where they saw that consuming, I think it was 40 grams a day of white button mushrooms, which are a very cheap, affordable food.
Yeah.
You might get bored of them. I mean, pregnancy is a funny time. Like, yeah. But if you can, if you like white button mushroom and can eat it throughout pregnancy, it lowers the risk of all kinds of hypertensive disorders in pregnancy. Also, there was a really, really good research on soy. It wasn't necessarily about preeclampsia, but it can help lower gestational diabetes risk. Again, we're talking like an average of like a 40-gram serving per day, which could be, like maybe even like 100 grams every 3 days or something like that, 120 grams every 3 days. But that
It's a little bit.
also, it improves outcomes in offspring. So it lowers the risk of gestational diabetes during the pregnancy, and it improves neuropsychiatric outcomes in offspring. Like it lowers the risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, which is very interesting, especially in conjunction with this big research. I saw this paper on soy and pregnancy outcomes about a year ago when I was doing research for a client. And then just like today, I saw this New York Times article that talked about gestational diabetes increasing the risk in offspring of childhood ADHD and other neuropsychiatric issues. And I'm like, yeah, that's why soy in lowering the gestational diabetes mellitus risk is lowering those risks to the offspring that kind of come as a package. So it's not like an additional benefit of soy, but it's probably contained in the package of the mom does not have GDM.
Right.
Yeah, so it's,
I love it. It's
I
cool.
mean, the more, even, pomegranate. Pomegranate is also pomegranate and garlic are foods that can help lower blood pressure.
And
So
just
in
to like
pregnancy,
put this in context for people, 40 grams of mushrooms is like 3 mushrooms.
it's
Yeah,
not
it's a
that
small
much.
amount.
Yeah.
Yeah.
White button mushrooms are really high in ergothioneine, right? Which is a really incredible antioxidant. I wonder if
Yes.
that has.
There's like cancer
And the
reduction
tempeh
studies.
also is really high in ergothioneine.
Yeah, that would be interesting to look into. Like I think that they might have good selenium content too.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be, combination. I always think it's never just one component of the food, but, multiple components. And, like when you can find a food like pomegranate or mushroom or, like fatty
Soy.
fish, like sardines that have multiple benefits. Wow, that's just great. Even nuts and seeds are really great because they're good sources of vitamin E, which which vitamin E was one of those things where we're not really 100% sure, but probably helpful and it's not going to hurt.
Right. And then, I mean, if you're taking a fish oil, my understanding is that you should be supplementing with vitamin E for its antioxidant properties, correct?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, and that is a common recommendation for women who have high blood pressure, have hypertension or preeclampsia, is to take a fish oil.
For sure.
Or have a high vitamin E intake, which is a little tricky, but if you
It
make
is.
sure you're eating those vitamin infused, because you have the different forms of vitamin E,
Yeah.
the gamma, the delta, and some of them are more effective, I think, right, than others. And in supplements, a lot of times they don't have
Yeah.
that form. That's the best one to have to increase your vitamin E, I guess, potential or status.
For sure. Yeah, there are different nuts and seeds have different profiles. So I tell people just do, either rotate them or mix them, make it like a trail mix or just like a mixed nut and seed mix that you just throw onto your salads or into your oatmeal or whatever. It's terrific, from many points of view. I say this a lot of the time to non-pregnant people. Vitamin E is one of the micronutrients I see lowest in food intakes on Chronometer when I have people track. It's hard to get
And
enough
that's
without.
a good tool for people to know about. It's a free tracking tool. I think they
Yeah,
have a paid version, but Chronometer is one of the few tracking tools that tracks macro and micronutrients.
it
So
does. And
I can't
it
remember you
looks
mentioning
at omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. It looks at
that.
fiber content. It looks at ratios of certain micronutrients too, like your calcium to oxalate if you're working with someone with a kidney stone risk,
Mm.
or with interstitial cystitis or vulvovaginitis or something that is associated with potentially being triggered by oxalates in the individual depending on the situation. But yeah.
I also just wanted to tell people on the Lab Smarts website, there's a whole blog on neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. So I think we linked to Lab Smarts in the show notes of the last episode, but it's a good resource whether or not you use the software. Go to the website and look at her blogs. There's great information there.
Yes.
So yeah. So, okay, just to recap, there's so much practical here, which I love. It's like eat mushrooms, eat pomegranate, eat garlic. It's so sad that, we have this kind of fear of soy in the holistic nutrition world, but
Mhm.
we've covered that. And I think we beat that horse to death. We have 2 episodes on
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
we're really lucky. Do you remember?
Dr. Messina, Mark
Yeah, Mark
Messina.
Messina.
And that was just so incredible because in the first episode, we were like, wow, what if we could get in touch with this expert? That
remember.
would be amazing.
Yeah.
And then he got in touch with us and he came on and he was so chill and wonderful
Yeah.
and just a joy to talk to. I love those episodes.
Yeah,
so much.
yeah. And he just knows so much.
Yeah. He's an expert. And if people are like, oh my gosh, soy, I'm not sure if I should eat that or not, be sure to listen to those episodes.
Yeah, I've sent the links to those soy podcasts to so many people, including moms of girls under 14. I'm like, you really want to reassess soy?
Yeah, reassess soy. And so, but yeah, basically what you're saying is there are these markers that you found in the research that can kind of tell you maybe there is some, increased risk here for preeclampsia, but then knowing how to understand those ranges, it's really important to
For sure.
pay
Yes,
attention
they
to that in
have to be
pregnancy.
interpreted in a pregnancy, on a basis of what is actually appropriate in pregnancy. So, like homocysteine is one of those markers. That's one I forgot earlier. It goes down in pregnancy for a variety of reasons versus in non-pregnant people.
Does methylation increase in pregnancy?
No, it's not supposed to increase. No, partly because
I don't mean homocysteine. What happens to methylation in pregnancy?
Oh yeah, methylation, yes. So
I'm curious if that's why homocysteine goes down.
So one of the reasons is because people are taking multivitamins with folate to prevent neural tube defects. And folate and B12, which are both in prenatals, you'll not see a multi that has folate but doesn't have B12 in it. They both lower homocysteine by supporting methylation.
Got it.
Also, there are other cofactors for methylation in any balanced multi, including B2, which can help the methylation cycle and everything that's sort of revolving around it.
Choline.
B6, choline, absolutely, yeah. A lot of prenatals don't have that much choline, but there's.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah.
Is that concerning?
Needed does. I like, so I'm not affiliated with any company, but the ladies who run Needed, who founded and run the company, are very into research. And I wrote them a question once because somebody that I had mentored had a question about the form of choline and the dose of choline in the Needed prenatal. And she sent me this wonderful response. It was so thorough. And she sent me links to articles. And it was super helpful in allowing me to address, the concerns that my colleague had raised about, is this safe? Because it's a legitimate question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Should people obviously, we want people to get as much of their choline as possible from whole foods like egg yolks, but that's not entirely, like chicken skins, things like that. That's not always possible. And sometimes people's desire for food will change day to day. And a lot of people have nausea and they just don't, it's just very hard to get those choline rich foods because they tend to be a little bit rich and hard, a little bit harder to digest in some stages. So if you're having nausea or reflux, they might not be your first go-to. So having a choline rich prenatal is really, really nice.
Yeah, and Needed is like the only one, as far as I know, that has that choline and the right amounts. I don't know. I found Needed
Yeah.
supplement, also not affiliated with them, but
Yeah.
after I'd had my son, like postpartum period, I found it. Prior to that, the one I was taking didn't have it. And I was like, well, I could eat 3 eggs a day. I was trying to calculate how much,
Yeah.
and eventually, because for that reason, I couldn't like stomach all of that, I started taking phosphatidylcholine. And
Yeah.
then you actually have to do the calculation to figure out how much choline you're getting instead of the phospholipids,
sure.
and like take a bunch. I mean, it's hard to figure it out.
Yeah, for sure. It can be hard. But yeah,
we'll put a link to Needed in the show notes so that people can check it out. And yeah, like we
great.
said.
Yeah. Seeking Health, I think, also has choline, but I can't remember if it's the whole
Okay.
300 milligrams that is in. I mean, formulations change over time too. So I can remember the milligrams of certain things and then they change. So yeah. But no, I really appreciate companies that are not just selling stuff. Sometimes companies will ignore you or get defensive when you ask them a question, and other companies will be like, oh wow, yeah, great question, here's the research we did, here the references, and that it helps build my trust when I can have a conversation like that and have my questions answered. It's really
absolutely, it's rare.
It is.
That's why I love Brian Johnson, Hannah. That's an inside joke. I guess it's not an inside joke. It's a public joke, but we covered that. I actually saw this ad the other day. It's the guy that, Sarah, he's trying to like reverse his biological age. And there's this Netflix documentary. But I saw this ad the other day where he was like, hey, maybe you've heard about me. I'm like the narcissistic, crazy millionaire tech bro that's trying to not die. Hi, that's me. He like played on it. And I was like, oh my God. Wow.
So funny. Yeah.
So anyway, he does have transparency, or he did in his products.
He did.
Yeah, maybe not anymore, but he did. Okay, so any other conditions though, Sarah, where it's like understanding pregnancy specific ranges would be really important. Preeclampsia, thyroid totally makes sense, just because we know about the prevalence of it's like autoimmune thyroid pops up for a lot of women after pregnancy.
Absolutely. Also, just making sure that you're looking at appropriate pregnancy-based ranges for glucose, which the labs actually have TSH, and they know that TSH and glucose values change during pregnancy compared to non-pregnancy, but still the optimal ranges are not always going to be reflected for thyroid function. So you could have a thyroid hypofunction issue that is not flagged on a lab test, for example. And then there is no routine test for antibodies. So somebody with a history of recurring miscarriage ideally should, or other conditions, infertility, that would family history of autoimmune thyroid disorders, should test for all the potential thyroid antibodies, ideally before conceiving, and find out if they have an autoimmune thyroid condition. If they do, I always recommend that people who have autoimmune thyroid disease also test for celiac disease antibodies while actively consuming gluten. And I've talked to many clinicians, and the gastroenterologist that I spoke with, who seemed to know the most about celiac disease, told me that she wants her patients to consume gluten every day, at least one serving, like the equivalent of a small plate of pasta or a slice of bread, every day for 2 months. She said that's most reliable for the antibodies. And that's a longer time span than I've seen in some of the articles.
I remember it being like 6 weeks or something.
It helps people not fall through the cracks. And she said, just having somebody start over again can be really exasperating. So just like one and done. And that seemed like a really trustworthy recommendation. But there's an HLA connection between, so that there's a shared genetic sort of baseline for susceptibility to both celiac disease and autoimmune thyroid issues.
Yeah. HLA is the gene, human leukocyte antigen.
Yeah.
Is that right? And so people with autoimmune diseases, just for listeners, if they're not familiar with what that is, tend to have those genes like turned on.
Yeah. Right. And that's an important point. It's not necessarily that those genes cause the disease. It's that people who test positive or have the symptoms of these diseases often have that genetic expression happening. And it might happen
Mhm.
and it might not. Like, I'm the
For
perfect
sure.
example of that. I didn't have any symptoms of celiac till I was exposed to a trigger, and then the symptoms started to come, but those genes were there the whole time.
Mhm.
That didn't change.
Right. And you
So
could have the genes. I mean, you have the genes your whole life and never develop an autoimmune disease. That's
For
possible
sure.
too.
totally.
Mhm.
Yeah.
God bless those people. Enjoy your gluten.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Which
And
is
that's
going
the
to be
thing.
one of our next topics.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're gonna
this is the other thing. I tell people, look, if you have celiac disease, you should not be consuming gluten, but you should know that. Don't just assume you have a serious gluten sensitivity. Like, do a rigorous elimination and reintroduction diet. And for heaven's sake, don't believe those people who say that Italian wheat is better.
Okay, Sarah, talk about that. We have this in our notes to ask you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, what's the deal with people go to Italy, they go to France, they pass by the TCA, they're like, "Oh, I really want, a baguette or whatever, delicious Italian pastry," and then they eat it and they're like, "I felt totally fine in Italy
Yeah.
eating the wheat." But what's the deal with that?
So yeah, I mean, your gut could have recovered for, like, either you could think that you're intolerant to gluten and not be. That's one thing.
Mhm.
That's extremely common. A lot of people are just biased against
Mhm.
wheat. And it's an unfortunate and very sad bias in the holistic world, because there are wonderful polysaccharides in gluten containing grains that I want everybody who can consume them with impunity to consume them.
Mhm.
But anybody who has an actual, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which means that, you do an elimination and reintroduction, but you don't have actual, like, celiac disease, or celiac disease, really should not consume gluten. I mean, celiac disease can go into remission, but then people can get it again. I talked to somebody who was diagnosed as a small child, and then after many years, she had another biopsy, and they said, "Oh, you don't have celiac disease anymore. You can consume gluten again." And it came back very ferociously.
Mm.
And
Wow.
her baseline of health has just never been the same ever since. So she
Wow.
sort of regretted,
Yeah.
assuming that she was okay. I mean, there could be people who heal and then can continue, but the point is, you want to monitor over time both your
Mhm.
antibodies and probably your small intestine,
And then
through.
is there anything special about the wheat in Italy?
No. And in fact, when you're in Italy, Italians consume so much wheat, and there's a much denser population on the Italian territory. Italians grow 10% of the wheat that they consume, and a lot of that is exported to the US because it's a
Mhm.
prized crop. It's kind of like quinoa that is exported from Peru. The Peruvian population hardly eats quinoa for that reason. So 40% of Italian pasta and other wheat-based goods are made with North American grown wheat, mostly Canadian, which I think is extraordinarily funny. And that's probably more now, because Ukraine used to be the main source of wheat imports into Italy.
Mm.
So I think that it's probably closer to 60% now. I haven't really gone in and looked
I
at.
want to pull that stat. I mean, I totally trust you, Sarah, but I'm like, I want this like hard stat because yeah, there is this thing that happens where people go on vacation and they're like, I ate the wheat. And
Yeah.
there was somebody not long ago that was, I like saw a video. Oh my God, it was Brett Weinstein or Weinstein. I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, but he hosts the Dark Horse podcast. He's kind of this like, I don't know, like a contrarian on the internet. And he was like in Europe and just like surrounded by pastry. And he was like, there's no way I could eat this, in the United States. And I just like heard your voice reverberating throughout my head where you're like, most of the wheat in Italy is imported from the United States. And I was like, oh my God. Or from North America, maybe not just the
Oh,
United
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
so
States.
most.
funny.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah,
the crazy placebo effect. I
it might, yeah.
Yeah,
Ooh.
that's really interesting. And like well, I'm not going to go into this. We can save it for our gluten episode,
Yeah.
but
But
'cause I
people
don't
are
want to.
more relaxed on vacation, and their digestion is just going to be
Exactly.
calmer. I mean, it's
The
just.
vacation effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that your immune system could still be triggered. So celiac
Mhm.
disease has three layers. One of them is gut, one of them is skin, and one of them is neurological. There's a high percentage of celiac patients who get diagnosed late because they don't have the typical symptoms that are GI
Mhm.
symptoms, and being underweight, having diarrhea. Those are the classic symptoms. A lot of people just have skin issues, and a
Mhm.
lot of people just have neuropsychiatric issues, or some, two of the above.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So for some people, it's just psychosis. There's an amazing paper published by a Sicilian team of doctors from a hospital that treated a little girl, 14-year-old girl with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And she tested negative for celiac disease, but every time she would eat gluten, she would get psychotic. And they did not believe the mother at all. They were like, this is just too wild to be true. So they hospitalized her, and they would give her, basically, like, without the girl knowing what was in the capsule, they would give her either wheat flour or rice flour. And she had psychotic episodes every time she ate wheat. There was just no denying it. And they wrote this paper, and it was just like, wow. So this is the other thing that is really fascinating, though. Like, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, in this paper and several other papers I read on psychosis and gluten, were correlated with non-celiac gluten sensitivity in autoimmune thyroid disease. So there is probably some kind of dynamic where either some people are falling through the diagnostic cracks of celiac diagnosis. So there is serum negative celiac disease, just like there is serum negative lupus and serum negative Hashimoto's.
So explain that, Sarah, what you mean when you
Yeah,
say
it means your antibodies are negative, but you're going to have a positive Marsh score when you do a small intestinal biopsy. That is not, you can have a positive Marsh score for reasons other than celiac disease. So they have to rule out those other reasons. But they did studies where they looked at people who were negative for celiac antibodies, but they had symptoms that were so suspicious. And they did find that on small intestinal biopsy, there was I think it was maybe 7% or something like that, were positive for celiac disease.
Wow. That's wild. And the Marsh score is where they like look at your villi and decide how atrophied it is. And then from that, they diagnose you. But you have to do a biopsy to do that. And some people don't get that far. They go and do the blood test, and then they're like, oh, well, your antibodies are fine. You're fine. But you're still having the symptoms, and you have to, I mean, just thinking about the time it would take for a person to figure that out and have good providers to make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. That's a lot, for a person to deal with and like handle, instead of just being like, well, fuck it, I don't care, I'm just going to keep eating how I'm eating and not, whatever.
Yeah. I think the standard allopathic medicine, at least in Italy, is really, really good at recognizing non-celiac gluten sensitivity as a real condition. And so at least that's good, because patients are then encouraged to be as rigorous as if they had celiac disease. But there's probably a proportion of these people who are falling through cracks and actually do have celiac disease. But this is interesting relating to postpartum, because postpartum thyroiditis is a factor that increases the risk of postpartum psychosis.
Okay.
Non-celiac gluten sensitivity and celiac disease are both known risk factors for postpartum psychosis.
I did not know that.
Bipolar disorder is including undiagnosed bipolar disorder, and often bipolar disorder episodes will first manifest in the postpartum period. So bipolar disorder is a huge factor for postpartum psychosis. So if you have postpartum depression, that is the first bipolar episode of a person who has undiagnosed bipolar disorder, and you give that person SSRIs, which is a standard treatment for postpartum depression, they are more likely to have a psychotic episode because of the bipolar disorder. And this is why
Wait, Sarah, can you explain that a little bit more? Like, why does the SSRI trigger that?
Yeah, because in unipolar depression, which is just like you're either like you have a normal mood, you're euthymic, or you go down. That's it. You don't go up.
Right.
So SSRIs are the treatment of choice in allopathic care because they help pull your mood up. However, in a person who is bipolar, they have their euthymic episodes, and then they have their manic or hypomanic episodes where they'll go up here, and then they'll have their depressive episodes where they'll go really far down and with a high risk of suicide. Bipolar disorder is a huge risk factor for suicide. What happens when a person with bipolar disorder, even undiagnosed, obviously, is prescribed an SSRI without taking into account the bipolar disorder itself? The person has to be on a mood stabilizer and probably an antipsychotic if they're going to be given an SSRI as part of the treatment plan, which usually I don't see medical teams giving bipolar patients' SSRIs at all. It's unusual. It does sometimes happen and there can be a basis for it, but they would never give a bipolar patient just an SSRI to treat their mood states.
So you're saying it like essentially like accentuates the manic episode.
It can trigger mania, and that can precipitate a psychotic episode, which in postpartum is an incredibly high risk for infanticide and suicide. It's just so sad.
Yeah, and it's like kind of hard. Like, let's say I'm just thinking, okay, it's like me. I've got like my ups and downs, but I'm like not diagnosed bipolar or whatever. But then let's say I have a baby, and then after the baby, like, how would someone know?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You can't know 100%. Bipolar disorder. I talked to a psychiatrist. I love talking to clinicians. I talked to a psychiatrist about a year ago who was treating 2 bipolar individuals that I personally know. So this is a person that I said, hey, I just want to go talk to her. We actually resolved a complex issue together. So we teamed up without knowing each other. And then I went and met her and we talked. And she said, yeah, bipolar disorder is a really hard diagnosis to make. We didn't talk about bipolar disorder diagnosis in pregnancy or postpartum. We were talking about it just in general. But she said, yeah, it's really, really hard. I will sometimes treat a person as if they have bipolar disorder without giving them the diagnosis if I'm not 100% sure, but I'm covering them. And I'm like, oh, that's a really good perspective.
Yeah. So from like a postpartum mom, like if she is not just feeling like baby blues or depressed, but if she also has times where she is like, I mean, mania.
Yeah.
I've been around it. So I'm kind of like, I know like some of the signs where it's like you maybe don't sleep as well or you stop sleeping. Like
you might not
have like,
yeah,
there's like kind of a high that's associated with it. This might just be something to be aware of.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some of the symptoms that bipolar mothers may have in postpartum can be really hard to distinguish from sleep deprivation symptoms. And unfortunately, sleep deprivation is a risk factor for mania, which can then trigger psychosis. And that is also in fathers because sleep deprivation in males is a trigger as well as for females, whether they've given birth or not. So even a bipolar dad, if he's just had a baby and is sleep deprived, then he could have a manic episode with a psychotic sort of component to it. So
it's important. I mean, that's a huge amount of the population are people who have that diagnosis. So I think it's really important to share.
3%. It's huge. But it's really interesting looking at the literature on people. So this is an area that has been identified in allopathic medicine as being absolutely critical. I have never seen discussions in the public space on social media or even among clinicians that I'm personally in contact with on this, but I found it in the literature. So there are a lot of OBGYN associations that are OBGYN clinicians who are part of these associations that are really in favor of basically screening every pregnant woman for, giving them a questionnaire and talking with them to try to identify undiagnosed bipolar cases. It can be really subtle. Not everybody so bipolar disorder is a spectrum, just like autism spectrum disorder. A lot of women with autism spectrum disorder have masked all their lives and they only realize that they have autism spectrum disorder after a child, usually a boy, will be diagnosed with the condition. And then they're like, wait, but this, and this, that I have all this. I was like this as a kid, like me too. And so they get diagnosed as an adult. And this can happen with bipolar in a similar sense that you have a baby and all of a sudden those things that were sort of like maskable, like those things you were kind of like embarrassed about, maybe maybe it was subtle. People would maybe tell you, oh, you talk really fast. Like, can you just slow down a little bit? That's like the hypomanic thing, right? And then they maybe slow down or maybe they'll isolate a little bit. They'll change jobs frequently, but they'll just seem a little bit, more
unique.
That's
what I like to call it.
Yeah. So like really cool, creative people like with good jobs and, a good income can totally be bipolar or autistic. Absolutely. So there's a lot of masking that happens. And so because of the frequency, because of the susceptibility to bipolar episodes and postpartum psychosis within that presentation during the postpartum period, OBGYNs have decided that this is just really, really important to screen for. And this is not just some, some conspiracy towards, let's medicate as many people as possible. That's not the point. Let's save lives. because
Sarah, I think that's really important to say this. People may not realize this, that there are all kinds of disease manifestations that are more prevalent in postpartum
oh
simply
yeah,
because your body has had this enormous glut of hormones for 9 months. It has just gone up, 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 up. And then one day you have the
yeah,
baby. And then it's like, it's not an immediate drop off, but it is a pretty quick drop off. Like, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding. The flux of hormone flush compared to the reduction hormone, that is a huge stressor on the body. And so if there is a predisposition to thyroiditis, to mental health stuff, like I mean, there's so many any autoimmune
oh yeah,
manifestation. I'm thinking about like colitis and Crohn's disease that I've seen in clients after they've had a baby. Those diagnoses tend to come then, and then it's all exacerbated
yeah,
by sleep deprivation, stress.
absolutely.
We haven't even talked yet about like body image and like all the
Oh
pressure that
yeah,
our society puts on us. So I guess I'm kind of just saying, like, if you are a new parent and you're experiencing that, that's completely normal. And we see that all the time clinically. It's just not talked about very
it's
often.
not. And it's, postpartum psychosis can look like, somebody just being obviously out of their minds, or it could look like somebody very quietly, not even talking about it, having these awful images of terrible things happening to their baby, and they're not happening and
Mhm.
they know it's not happening,
But
but
they're
they can't control
terrified.
that. They're just like,
Yeah.
seeing that.
Intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
So
Intrusive.
yeah, yeah. So
Totally.
there's a spectrum to it, and it is really important to talk with one's trusted healthcare providers and get the right type of help, because these conditions can escalate quickly. I mean, when I was studying for my dissertation, I found a description in a Latin
Right.
law text of
You
of what
told
was
us, Sarah.
obviously postpartum
Yeah,
psychosis.
and the judge was like, this woman was acting outside of her
Yeah,
control because she was experiencing this
yeah,
type
yeah. They
of.
didn't know why. They didn't have a name for it, but it was there in the Middle Ages. It's not a new thing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say to women, if you are experiencing symptoms and your provider is not taking you seriously, get another provider.
For sure.
I mean, that's such a loaded statement because it's like some people are stuck in their insurance or, they have this roadblock. But if you're able to talk to another licensed clinician, it's so important to have
Yeah.
support. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in situations like this, I honestly think that just even reaching out to your best friends and saying, "Do you have a trusted doctor who could even like see me for free?" Like, gosh, if I was a doctor, I would be
Yeah.
like, "Come on in."
I
I
know
mean,
you
who
would.
wouldn't?
Yeah.
Like there's so many doctors who are also moms. I found this
Mhm.
beautiful article on PubMed by a female physician who talked about her postpartum psychosis episodes as part of her bipolar issues, and she was, she talked about suicide attempts. She was very candid, but I mean, I can only imagine how vulnerable, it must have felt to do this work, but it was really, really important to her. I mean, anybody who has looked this stuff in the face, has
Yeah.
seen a patient who suffered, or maybe even had a patient or had a colleague with a patient who killed themselves or killed their babies, they will be like, "Oh my gosh, I don't care about the money. Just come in. I will help you,
Mhm.
whatever it is, like,
And I think
yeah,
it's important to say too, this doesn't just exist in functional medicine. For instance, I think I've just been very lucky where we are in Boston. I've never not gone to the doctor and told them whatever I have anxiety, whatever crazy thing is happening in my, like general anxiety disorder brain, and them not take me very seriously. So you don't have to have some like cash-based special
yeah, yeah,
clinician.
yeah,
Like you
absolutely.
can hopefully find the help that you need from the doctor that your insurance
Yeah,
covers.
yeah,
Yeah, that
absolutely. That wonderful psychiatrist that I went and talked to, she made time out of her day. She works in a free clinic,
yeah,
that they're very, very busy.
yeah. It's just
But she
important
took
for
the time
people
to
to
meet with me
realize
for
that.
45 minutes,
Yeah.
obviously for free. We just talked as colleagues, and it was really good. Yeah.
Yeah, there's good people in all areas of medicine. Okay, so Sarah, just to make sure that we're covering all bases, like we talked about markers in preconception and in pregnancy. Do you want to talk a little bit about the markers that change in postpartum? I know
Yeah.
there's not a ton. Like, in how many are in pregnancy? The ranges are different, like over
Over
100.
100.
Yeah.
Yeah. In postpartum, we had like probably like a dozen, but
But still, it's important, especially if
it's
you're in this
really
state.
important.
If you're like
Yeah.
perfectly healthy after a baby, you still had a baby.
Yeah,
It's like an
absolutely.
easy thing to just come out. So, and then you see like, oh my God, my ALK phos, a month after giving birth is still high. That's
For
like
sure.
one that
Even 18
maintains.
months, if you're
Right.
breastfeeding, it can be
Yeah.
still high. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of what markers should people kind of be on the lookout for in postpartum?
Yeah. Yeah. So the white blood count and differential can be altered for up to a year.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay, and
So
just to remind people, that's white blood cells, and then you see like the breakdown of the different types of white blood cells. Those are the differentials,
yeah,
neutrophils,
neutrophils, lymphocytes,
lymphocytes,
all of those.
basophils.
They go a little bit up and down, so it's not that linear. Really my general um suggestion here is if you're a practitioner and if you're a patient and you're looking at labs and something is flagged on your white blood count and differential and you don't have symptoms that are associated with that thing being flagged, like say your neutrophils are like really high or potentially kind of low, that could be totally normal as your immune system is sort of readjusting postpartum. It's
Right.
the immune system undergoes incredible shifts and they change person to person. So, autoimmune in pregnancy, some women with lupus go into remission. Some women have
Right.
lupus flares that are horrific. Some people have lupus onset during a pregnancy. I know someone who was actually diagnosed with lupus when she was a teenager, and her one dream in life was to be a mother and a housewife. And her doctor at the time told her, "You can't have babies." And she was like, "What?"
Mm.
She had a kid. Like, she married very young. She had a kid as soon as possible. She was like, yeah, at least I'll be as young as possible and maybe my lupus won't be as advanced. But yeah.
And did she experience a remission? I mean, what was her?
She's not somebody that I really talked with in depth about her medical history. I just listened to what she said. I didn't want to go into it too much. But I don't know. I should ask her.
Yeah,
But
to see and that's important for people to know. Like, I mean, essentially, your body has to tell itself, your immune system has to tell your body and itself, don't kill this baby. It is a foreign body. I think there's like a little bit of, I mean, of course, not everybody like takes immunology, but it's like everything that we interact with as humans gets passed through like the filter of the immune system. So the immune system is either like, do we go after this thing or not? But it kind of samples everything. And so when we get pregnant, those cells under normal circumstances would look foreign and should be taken care of, taken out. But our immune system has to shift so that we're able to gestate
for
that
sure.
baby. And so there's all these shifts that occur. And so it totally makes sense what you're saying, that our white blood cells, one of the biggest, like factors of the immune system, is going to be off for a little while. But a
For
year,
sure.
that's incredible.
Yeah. Plus, in pregnancy, there are two foreign bodies basically inside the mother that are 50% from the dad. So
Right.
that's the placenta and the fetus. Like, we forget sometimes that the placenta is 50% from the father, but they interact with the maternal immune system in ways that science hasn't even fully been able to describe yet. It's just wild. And there is a paternal contribution to preeclampsia that we found when we were doing the research that was mediated by the placenta. So it's very, very interesting.
We can blame the dad.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that is one of the coolest things I have ever read about, ever. The placenta and the paternal DNA and how that activates the mother's immune system and how it can be influenced by how long you have been with that partner.
For sure. How much you've been
system.
exposed to their actual sperm. So if you use barrier contraceptive methods, they're like, that person is still a stranger to the immune system. It's wild.
Yeah, there's no
and that's
tolerance that's developed.
Yeah. So, and the immune system piece gets even more complex when you work with a situation where there was in vitro fertilization with an egg donor or, conception via sperm donor, because then you have different people's immune systems all interacting with each other, or surrogacy. So yeah, it's that can all like be part of the mix.
Right.
Of the immune sort of like reshuffling that happens during pregnancy and postpartum.
And is there a higher risk there of like preeclampsia or other issues with IVF or with?
There is. Yeah.
I mean, it's just good for people we're not saying like, don't do this. We're just saying like, hey, be aware that these certain, I don't want to speak out of turn, but it's like, could you kind of say like, what certain issues might somebody who's done IVF or sperm donor be more susceptible to?
Yeah. And almost, part of that is age too. It's an interaction both of the age and the donor egg issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They are both independent factors for, just specific types of risks that can happen in pregnancy. And in fact, I don't think I've ever worked with a woman in her 40s who conceived via IVF who was not recommended to take baby aspirin. And baby aspirin is really effective preeclampsia prevention, a strategy that has been very well researched. It's a good
It's like gold
evidence-based
standard,
strategy.
right?
Sorry?
It's gold standard, isn't it?
It's gold standard. Yeah, absolutely. And so I always tell people, if you're pregnant and your medical team is recommending that you take baby aspirin, take it.
Take it.
Just do. There are many, many reasons why they could be recommending it. They're not just recommending it, just because they like it.
Because they're associated with the aspirin company.
Yeah, I don't think that really is giving them much of a kickback at this point. So, yeah.
Okay, so the white blood cells, we talked about ALK Phos stays elevated. Alkaline phosphatase. Kind of
other liver enzymes, ALT, GGT, and AST all go up wildly the first 5 to 10 days, especially if a person, like the more interventions they had in labor, the more they're going to go up. But they're going to go up even in the most tranquil home birth situation or, without interventions or anything. So that's just normal. And that's important to know if you're working with somebody who has, say, autoimmune hepatitis, which can flare in postpartum. And I've seen that happen. So the hepatologist needs to be able to distinguish between normal liver enzyme changes in the early postpartum period and also ALK Phos that can stay elevated for a long time versus an actual flare in the condition.
Yeah, important. It's so important.
So that is interesting. Red blood cells, hemoglobin, and hematocrit can be altered for up to 6 months after birth. And that in turn,
big deals. It's
like
a really big deal.
That in turn is one of the reasons the hemoglobin is one of the reasons why hemoglobin A1C is different for about 12 weeks after birth. Now, the other reason is that hemoglobin A1C is just an average of your glucose for the past 3 months. And during pregnancy, the glucose ranges are completely different. So your average, like a month or 2 months after birth is going to be mixed in with the average that you had before and after delivery. And those are different ranges. Right. So the important number to remember with hemoglobin A1C is 5.7. If it's over 5.7 in the postpartum period, there's probably something wrong. And that is recognized from an allopathic perspective.
Okay, so doctors are like kind of GPs are familiar with that. Okay, any other markers? I just know we're like coming up on an hour. I'm like, I just want to get in as much as possible.
Prolactin. So prolactin starts rising in pregnancy itself, reaches a peak of, so non-pregnant prolactin levels are about 25. And then they go all the way up to 200 at delivery. And then as you lactate, they stay elevated but slowly go down over time in women whose cycles return within the first 3 to 6 months. Those levels are going to be lower, regardless of how good your milk production and milk quality is. There's not a correlation, but your prolactin levels are going to be lower if you're menstruating than if you're not. But they will stay somewhat elevated, like around 50, which is about twice as high as the normal, like non-pregnant levels throughout lactation. So that's,
it's important these are so important to know. I mean, I could just imagine like, okay, postpartum, and then maybe you're even a little bit familiar with your blood test and you get a blood test done and you see your liver enzymes are super high. It's just good to know, like, hey, this is part of postpartum.
For sure.
This is not abnormal. Hannah, any questions that you have before we?
Yeah, but it'll take us over. So no questions. Sorry. I do have questions, but I'll hold on until next time.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, you got to come back, please. I feel like every time we talk to you, I'm like, this is an episode idea. This is an episode idea. There's so many different ones. But thank you so much for coming on. Yeah.
Thank you for having me again. I'm sorry that I'm so ridiculous today with these lit up headphones.
I love it. It's cracking me up.
People who are just listening, Sarah's totally hearkening to our love of UFOs and aliens with her.
Absolutely. Yes. And my son's love of Minecraft. I'll just say that.
Totally. Okay, Sarah, so we'll probably see you in future episodes, hopefully.
Yeah. I would love to be back at some point, and I'll try to be more professional looking.
Yeah.
Well, we're not professional at all.
Okay, well, that's good. I fit right in then.